Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and I'm absolutely thrilled today to have back with me Alan Saquella. Alan, first of all, welcome back to the podcast.
Tom, it's great to be back.
Alan, could you remind our audience of your professional background?
Sure. I started off in the law enforcement arena way back and ultimately led into corporate compliance investigations within the corporate arena. Did that for 30 years, where I spent a lot of time looking at different types of corporate criminal activity from an insider's perspective. Then retired and went into academia. So I'm teaching at a university at this point.
What university and what are you teaching?
Great. I'm teaching in a university called Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in the College of Business Security and Intelligence. We do have two campuses, one in Prescott, Arizona, where I teach, and then the other campus is in Daytona Beach. I teach white-collar crime, security investigations, interview techniques and tactics, and crisis resiliency and recovery. Those are four classes I spend most of my time in.
Alan, we're going to visit today generally about retaliation, whistleblowers, speak up culture, and those types of issues. I've just finished a blog post on Boeing, so that's obviously front of mind for me. But maybe we could start with, how does the fear of retaliation from senior leadership affect middle managers' willingness to address unethical issues, as opposed to maybe someone at the bottom who might be willing to raise their hand and speak up?
Tom, that's a great point. And in my career, I found that middle managers are the most reluctant. They're in that spot where they're in a career path. They're usually family members. They're in a position where they want to do well. They want to promote, but at the same time, they're very cautious because they've seen that through previous experiences that retaliation does occur. And that's always a concern because they do want to keep their jobs and they want to continually grow within the organization. I've seen it happen multiple times in my career, which I know we'll be talking about later on. Retaliation can take many forms. And of course, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on with the program. But I can share some examples as well.
What are the consequences of this fear of middle managers?
The consequences, of course, could be by speaking up. In most private or corporations, we have a ethics hotline, those types of vehicles to report. And although things can be reported confidentially, but I think middle managers want to share openly with their bosses what they see, what they observe, and some of the consequences may be something simple as, "Don't worry about it. We're not going to deal with it. We'll look into it. Nothing gets done," all the way down to potential termination of the reporter. And of course, that's being the most severe consequence of reporting directly to the reporter. At the same time, it impacts the company if they don't act upon it. I mean, you brought up before the show Boeing, and there's plenty of other examples like that where different types of unethical practices were going on, safety issues were not being dealt with, and even those types of things were reported. And of course, we know the outcome of Boeing. So there's just concerns directed towards the middle manager, but there's also concerns if it's not being dealt with, how it could impact the corporation as a whole.
Alan, I don't think many compliance professionals think of C-suite or executives' decisions around vendor and supplier selection as creating ethical dilemmas in a speak up culture, or for a whistleblower, or for middle managers who may have to intake that information. But you see things a little bit differently in that arena. Could you explain that to us?
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about middle managers, and when I talk about middle managers, it's usually the managers and the directors. At the C suite, certainly they're providing the strategy for the organization. So when we talk about vendor selection, supplier selection, when you're onboarding, there's obviously should be a standardized process in how these organizations that you're bringing in, contractors, should be selected and should be done in a very uniform, strategic, and also a way that's done objectively so that there is no favoritism in the selection. What I have seen in my career when, let's say, a supplier or vendor is brought on and they deviated from the selection process, you have the risk, some sort of favoritism or other types of relations that could have impacted the decision on the selection of that vendor. And you may not always get the right price. You may have a higher price. Now, we know in government, they always want a lower price. In the private or corporate sector, you want to look at more than just price. You want to make sure they have quality. Have they worked with this type of entity or enterprise before? You want somebody in aerospace, if they've worked in aerospace, then they better be familiar with what we're building over here before we bring them on board. And I've seen times in my career where vendors, suppliers are brought on that may not have been qualified, but middle managers might have said, okay, here's the process we followed. We recommend these top two vendors. They provide that to the leadership at the top and say, pick the best based on this. And they maybe deviate. They don't go with the standardized process and they pick somebody else, maybe related to them or somehow maybe some nepotism or favoritism of some sort that impacted that decision. And again, it could cause quite a bit of rift in the morale on the middle management side, but also it may not benefit the company as a whole from a financial standpoint, as well as they just may not be qualified.
Well, Alan, you have beyond simply the cultural issue, or as I think you said, creating a rift in morale, it can actually lead to, if not corruption, or excuse me, if not corporate crime, corruption. How does that sort of environment create the opportunity for things to really go off the rails?
The thing is, if the C-suite or the upper echelon is allowing this type of process to occur, or if they're deviating from standard ethical processes in the selection of vendors and or suppliers, then what else are they allowing? Because we know that starts at the top and above the top is the board. The board needs to have visibility what the C-suite is doing. And we know that not everything is reported to the board. And so sometimes the C-suite may keep some things from them. And of course, that will establish a culture which can be very disruptive in an organization. If you have unethical business practices occurring, think about the red flag indicators in a fraud environment. A lot of times, corruption breeds all kinds of behaviors within an organization. And that corruption may be simply because we want to expand our business in Mexico, someplace else. By deviating from the process or the C-suite allowing this to happen, what kind of message are they sending? And that encourages other types of activity. And that could include criminal activity, like we talked about. Now, we got the issues of foreign corrupt practices. You also have corporate criminal liability, which we've seen in Boeing. All these different types of things arrive out of not complying, and also unethical business practices are allowed to continue to occur within an organization. And it's really, it has to start at the top, and you have to have good ethical C-suite, follow the process, and let the middle managers do what they're trained to do. And of course, I think if you have that type of culture, you're going to have the benefit of hopefully deterring these types of activities that could lead to criminal activities within an organization.
Well, I'd like to turn now to some of the mechanics of whistleblowing and actual whistleblower programs, whether you call that a hotline, whether you call that a whistleblower program, whether you say it's mandated by Dodd-Frank, Sarbanes-Oxley. But what's the significance of these mechanisms and confidential hotlines in addressing the challenges faced by middle managers?
Like I mentioned earlier, middle managers, when they see unethical business practices or non-compliance going on within an organization, they would rather go directly to their supervisor. Because we certainly want to try that route. Uh, the the disadvantage of that, of course, is the fear of retaliation, like we talked about. Confidential hotlines or whistleblowing hotlines are there, hopefully, to encourage reporting, but at the same time to protect the reporter. Now, on the government side, and we can see what happened not too long ago with the FBI. You had a couple agents report something, and they were exposed. Their careers, unfortunately, are over. In a corporate environment, ethical hotlines are there, and you can report confidentially, but usually it can go back to the person because if they have specific information, it's easy to type back. They are good. I think ethical hotlines Actually, in many cases, and we found this out back in the late 80s when they first started using them in corporations, they actually deter behavior because they're publicized within an organization and people may be afraid to act if they're in fear of someone actually reporting on ethical practices. So they do deter some activity if they're well publicized, but at the same time, it's a good vehicle to report those types of practices. Now, as we know, the information that's reported has to be investigated. Now, on the corporate side, we also found a lot of the reports were sometimes a way to report something that was just a way to get back at someone else. Unfortunately, they will tie up the compliance department or a human resource department in the corporate environment because everything has to be investigated. And of course, it could create and did create a lot of additional work for them to kind of get through what was real and what was not.
How can an organization actively promote and ensure the effectiveness of these mechanisms, Alan? Or is it just a longer term building trust play?
I think it's a combination. I think most organizations now have had them for decades, 2 to 3 decades. These have been pretty common. I think communication, it has to be when you bring on new managers and employees, it has to be day one, new hire orientation. You have to talk about compliance. You talk about the ethics hotline. So you need that. It's education, it's promotion. And of course, you have to be believable from a corporate setting. One of the things you don't want to do is ever violate the confidentiality or trust. So I think uh, it's something you continue to do, and it has to start at the top. The C-suite has to embrace the program and the confidentiality of it to assure that it's being used properly and it's not being abused. I think they're good. They do certainly work when we have an ethical C-suite, but just another vehicle to assure compliance and ethical behavior.
What's the role of senior leadership? Obviously, they've got to talk the talk, but they've got to walk the walk. If you were brought in to counsel a board or counsel a C suite, how might you help guide them through what you see as their role in fostering not simply a culture of speak up, but really to use the mechanisms that's available to every company?
You're absolutely right. So it's one thing to say it, right? You have to demonstrate it. Think about the C-suite. When they walk down a hallway, they're on stage. They're always on stage, and they're being watched by every employee at every level. Anything they do or say is going to be interpreted. And of course, they have to be constantly aware. And they got to be aware of their behavior. So certainly, when they're talking about we got to make our sales goals, we're not meeting it, and they make a statement like, "We do whatever we can to get that sales. We got to close that sale." Now, what kind of message is that sending? They have to be careful in everything they do and say, and not give any opportunity for misinterpretation. And that goes back to, again, creating the right behavior and demonstrating. Certainly, you have to have the right culture, and it starts at the top. But at the same time, if there's a situation where we have a history on unethical business practices, so think about Boeing. And another recent case was with Comcast that happened last year, 2 years ago, where one of their employees had a history of workplace violence. He wound up killing a customer in a customer's home, and they covered up his history of workplace violence. And of course, they were certainly found guilty of corporate criminal liability as well. So there was some unethical practices. What kind of message are we sending the rest of our employees by not handling appropriate Boeing? They're going to have some challenges. And some of these other companies that are not demonstrating what they preach, and that's going to reverberate for years and decades. Some companies have to change their name, and of course, we know some don't survive those types of significant falls. Again, I think what we also have to do is think about celebrating ethical practices instead of just going after the unethical. If we have some things going on, we have to flip the switch. We have to look at ethics and compliance as a positive thing and not punitive. I think we also, and within corporations, I'd recommend to the C-suite, we have to look for those practices that encourage corruption or unethical business practices And let's try to switch them, change them. Give you one example. You think about any type of commission sales or an oriented organization. If you're pushing commissions and sales that make the sales, what that does, that breeds unethical practices because they're always striving to get the top performers always recognized. But if you look deeply into those, some of the top performers are riding on the edge of being ethical and unethical. Some companies have gone to a shared commission. Departments benefit as a whole if everyone contributes. So we may want to look at, or they may want to look at, depending on the formatting, how they're in the compensation, how they rewarding success. And then I think if we're going to look at holding corporations accountable for ethical business practices, I think we need to look beyond corporations and look at industry associations and boards that are looking at ethical compliance of an industry, and they hold all the members accountable. That's been pretty successful that I've seen in certain industries. So I think it's a lot of things, and it goes beyond just the C-suite and the board.
Let me change the focus just a little bit to whistleblower protection. Since the last time we visited, there have been announcements from the Department of Justice that they're going to institute a financial incentive for whistleblowers program. We don't have a final program yet, so we don't know exactly what that might entail, but I would guess it'd be along the lines of what the SEC has in place. But whistleblower protection, particularly after Boeing, I think has become more front of mind than it had been. Where do you see whistleblower protection down the road? And do companies really understand the value of protecting whistleblowers to their own organizations?
And I've worked in a lot of corporations, and I actually consult two organizations where we're working with corporations. I think they're heading down the right path, at least on the corporate side. They mean they want to do it, but what bottom line to a corporation is return on investment, earnings per share. What do they look like in the public? They're always concerned about that. Obviously, they have to be viable, they have to be profitable, they have to continue onward. So really, overall, whatever they're doing has to align with their financials because they have to be in business. And I think they have to have a separation so that there's always the protection of the whistleblower. The whistleblower or the person that calls in on the ethics hotline has to have some sort of assurance of protection. Now, you and I know if if it goes back to an area within a particular department, it's easy to identify who the whistleblower is. Even though you have confidential hotlines, ultimately it's found out. Uh, Companies that are proactive may be looking at employees and looking at the culture by doing confidential employee opinion hotlines. How is the company doing? What's the culture like? They should be doing those before they have an ethical breach or a compliance issue. We can understand what's going on in the corporation, how the employees feeling, how things going within the corporation. They can address it sooner. I think that tends to help. But protection's key. I think corporations want to do it, but if it causes too much disruption, there may be some sort of retaliation that occurs by somebody else in the organization. And again, it may cause people to be reluctant to report.
Alan, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I did want to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you or find out any more information on the topics you've touched upon today, what might be the best place or places for them to go?
Yeah, Tom, best way to reach me is on LinkedIn. I put everything out there that I publish or write or speak on. So go to my LinkedIn uh, profile. You can see what's out there. One thing I didn't mention on this show is I've also co-authored a textbook that I use in my university, and there's some additional data in that. It's called the Security Investigations: A Professional's Guide, and it does talk about investigations within corporations, which of course certainly touches on compliance, ethics, and how to conduct those. May not necessarily be related to this, but that might be another source for anyone that's really interested in that. Of course, that can be found on Amazon. Okay, that's my pitch there, Tom. I certainly, but LinkedIn's the best way to reach me.
Well, Alan, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation going forward.
Uh, Me as well. Thank you so much, Tom, for having me on.